They stand beneath massive stone columns, beneath arched openings, beneath a coffered ceiling so high that the waiting room seems built at a scale meant to overpower everyone inside it. The first photograph looked ordinary until I stopped looking at the architecture and started looking at the passengers. They are the scale, and once you see how small they are, the room becomes difficult to forget. This was not a palace. It was not a government hall. It was a train station in Manhattan. The grand waiting room belonged to the original Pennsylvania station, opened in 1910 as part of one of the largest railroad projects ever brought into New York, and a little more than half a century later, the room in that photograph was deliberately dismantled. The explanation is documented. Railroad economics were changing. Manhattan land was extraordinarily valuable, and train operations could continue below while the space above was redeveloped. That explains how the building could disappear. But the photograph creates a different question. It does not explain the strange timing, because while this architecture was being removed, New York was only beginning to develop the preservation system that might have protected buildings like it. So the question is not simply why Penn Station was demolished, it is why New York had to lose a room like this before deciding that some buildings should not be so easy to lose. The answer begins with a distinction that is almost invisible in the photograph. Everything we are looking at, the columns, the high windows, the stone, the enormous volume of air above the passengers, feels inseparable from the railway station itself. But technically, it was not. The railway was somewhere else, beneath the floor. Original plans of Pennsylvania Station reveal a building organized vertically. The great public rooms occupied the world above. Below them, on different levels, passengers moved toward platforms and tracks. 11 platforms served the underground rail complex. Tunnels carried trains beneath the rivers and into Manhattan. That arrangement had been one of the station's great engineering advantages. Decades later, it would become one of the reasons the architecture was vulnerable. To understand why, it helps to reconstruct what Pennsylvania Station had originally been built to solve. Before the station existed, the Pennsylvania Railroad faced a basic geographical problem. Its trains approaching New York from the west did not simply continue into Manhattan. Passengers reached New Jersey and then completed the journey across the Hudson by ferry. The railroad wanted something far more direct. Its early 20th century New York improvement project drove railway tunnels beneath the Hudson, then commonly called the North River, and brought Pennsylvania Railroad trains into Manhattan itself. The terminal constructed above that new infrastructure was designed by McKim, Meade, and White, and almost nothing about it suggested that the railroad considered the building merely a practical shelter over tracks. The site stretched between 7th and 8th Avenues, from West 31st to West 33rd Streets, effectively covering 2 Manhattan blocks. The completed project used approximately 27,000 tons of steel, about 500,000 cubic feet of granite, 17 million bricks, and roughly 83,000 square feet of skylights. Those numbers matter because the photographs can make the building strangely difficult to judge. Its spaces are so large that, without people inside them, scale becomes abstract. The waiting room rose approximately 150 feet. Its design drew on monumental Roman architecture, particularly the baths of Caracalla. 8 immense thermal windows brought daylight into the interior. Beyond it, the train concourse changed character completely. Instead of massive Roman-inspired masonry, steel and glass created a lighter engineering space above the tracks. The building was therefore doing 2 things at once. It was solving a transportation problem, and it was turning the arrival of a train into a civic experience. That helps explain why the people in the old waiting room photograph seem so small. They were supposed to. Penn Station belonged to an era when a major railroad could treat its terminal as infrastructure, corporate statement and monumental gateway at the same time. Limited train operations began there in September 1910. Full Pennsylvania Railroad service followed on November 27th. For the first time, the railroad had direct access into Manhattan. But there is another detail in the old engineering drawings that becomes more important than any measurement of the ceiling. The tracks were below street level. That meant the monumental building above them did not perform exactly the same function as the transportation system underneath. For decades, this distinction barely mattered. Passengers experienced Penn Station as a single place. They entered through monumental exterior colonnades and beneath sculptural groups and giant clocks. They crossed its public halls. They descended toward the trains. Architecture and railway seemed to be one system. Economically, however, they could eventually be separated, and after the Second World War, the circumstances surrounding American passenger rail began to change. Automobiles competed for journeys once made by train. Highways expanded. Air travel became increasingly important. The Pennsylvania Railroad, like other passenger railroads, faced a far more difficult financial environment than the one in which its Manhattan monument had been conceived. In 1946, immediately after the extraordinary wartime peak in railway travel, the Pennsylvania Railroad recorded its first annual financial loss. That fact does not mean the railroad suddenly stopped working, and it does not mean demolition became inevitable. The station continued to handle passengers. The tracks were still necessary. What changed was the economic question surrounding everything above them. A building occupying 2 midtown blocks did not exist in an economic vacuum. The land was extraordinarily valuable, and the railroad was maintaining an enormous architectural complex on top of infrastructure that, from an operational standpoint, could function below ground. Once those two facts were considered together, Penn Station could be looked at in an entirely different way, not as one indivisible railway monument, but as two assets occupying the same site, a transportation system underneath and development space above. Evidence that this way of thinking had taken hold appears years before the final demolition plan. In 1954, Webb and Knapp obtained an option connected with development rights over the Penn Station site. The following year, the Pennsylvania Railroad pursued plans with developer William Zeckendorf that would have replaced the station with a large commercial development while placing passenger facilities below street level. That project did not proceed, but its significance is difficult to miss. The idea of removing the monumental building did not begin with Madison Square Garden. By the mid-1950s, the basic logic was already present. Keep the railway. Redevelop the space above it. This changes the way the old waiting room photograph has to be read. The passengers prove that the station was being used. But use alone could not protect the architecture, because the transportation function those passengers required did not necessarily require this particular room to remain standing. By 1960, a new Madison Square Garden Corporation was pursuing construction above the site. Plans to replace the terminal became public in 1961. The proposed arrangement followed the same principle earlier redevelopment schemes had already demonstrated. The railway would remain below ground. The enormous architectural volume above it could be converted into something financially different. That is the central fact behind Penn Station's destruction. Because the trains did not have to stop, the argument over the building became something much more complicated than whether New York still needed a railway station. It became a question of whether New York needed this railway station. The distinction mattered. The Pennsylvania Railroad was a private owner under financial pressure. Its property occupied some of the most valuable real estate in Manhattan. From that perspective, preserving the monumental halls carried a cost. Redeveloping the airspace above the tracks created value. None of this proves that demolition was the only possible outcome. It does explain why demolition became economically attractive, and yet economics alone still does not explain why the station could actually be removed, because by the early 1960s, people were already arguing that it should not be. Opposition formed around architects, preservationists, and civic activists. The Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, AGBANY, challenged the plan. Its members did not limit themselves to private objections. They petitioned officials. They argued before the City Planning Commission. They proposed preservation and reuse. And on August 2nd, 1962, demonstrators gathered outside Penn Station. Among those associated with the protest were architect Philip Johnson and urban activist Jane Jacobs. The surviving photographs of those demonstrations are important because they correct an easy retrospective assumption. Penn Station was not demolished because nobody noticed what was happening. People noticed. They protested while the building was still there. But the size of that opposition should not be exaggerated either. The most visible demonstrations mobilized only several hundred people. This was not an overwhelming citywide movement capable of imposing its will through sheer political force. And even more importantly, cultural importance was not the same thing as legal protection. That difference is the second critical distinction in the story. Today, it can seem natural to imagine that a building of Penn Station's architectural significance would simply be designated and protected. But the mature New York City landmark system did not yet exist when the decisive redevelopment battle was being fought. Penn Station was never a designated New York City landmark. The preservation movement in New York had already begun before its destruction. People had already fought to save historic buildings. There was already an awareness that older architecture could disappear permanently. What did not yet exist was the effective legal machinery that would later give the city substantial regulatory power over important privately owned structures. So, preservationists faced a basic problem. They could argue that the building mattered. They could demonstrate. They could petition. They could make the cultural case. But admiration, by itself, did not create an enforceable prohibition on demolition. That is the legal gap hidden behind the photographs of the protest. The station was recognized by many people as important, but recognition had not yet become protection. On October 28th, 1963, demolition began, and this is where the surviving photographic record becomes almost difficult to reconcile with the images from half a century earlier. The same building that had been assembled from enormous quantities of granite, steel, glass, and brick was dismantled piece by piece. Its sculptural elements were removed. Its masonry came down. Its monumental halls opened to the sky. The process lasted roughly 3 years and was substantially complete by 1966. But underneath the destruction, railway operations continued. That fact deserves more attention than it usually receives. Penn Station did not close, sit abandoned, and then disappear. The above-ground station was being removed while the transportation system beneath it remained alive. Passengers still needed the tracks. They still needed the tunnels. They still needed access to trains. What they did not need, in the narrowest operational sense, was a 150-foot waiting room. And once the architecture was judged independently from the railway, almost every part of the original monument became vulnerable. The consequences can still be examined physically. One surviving fragment is an approximately 11-foot-high figure carved from pink granite. It is Adolph A. Weinman's Knight. Around 1910, Knight formed part of Penn Station's exterior sculptural program, standing beside one of the great clocks over an entrance. Today, it belongs to the Brooklyn Museum. Its museum provenance records what happened after the architectural system around it vanished. The figure was salvaged during the station's destruction and given to the museum by companies involved in demolition and cartage. The sculpture survived. The entrance did not. The clock did not remain where it had been, and the station that once gave the figure scale and purpose disappeared around it. Another surviving object at the museum makes the loss even more physical. A massive section of an interior travertine column remains. Seen alone, it is already large, but in the old waiting room photographs, columns of this scale were only part of the background. That is how enormous the room was. The people gave the building scale in the photograph. The surviving column gives the photograph scale in return. Other fragments followed different paths. Stone eagles from the station were salvaged and dispersed. Some elements entered institutional collections. Others survived because individuals saved them. Large quantities of stone and architectural material were removed from Manhattan and deposited in New Jersey. What had once existed as one coherent work of architecture became a scattered field of objects. A figure here, an eagle somewhere else, a section of column in a museum, photographs in archives, engineering drawings in collections. The strange result is that Penn Station now survives almost like an archaeological site that was taken apart in modern times. The evidence is plentiful. The building is missing, and while that process was still underway, New York's legal treatment of historic architecture began to change. On April 19, 1965, Mayor Robert F. Wagner signed New York City's Landmarks Law. Penn Station was still being demolished. The law created the Landmarks Preservation Commission with actual regulatory authority. It would be too simple to say that Penn Station alone created that law. It did not. Preservation activism had existed before the station was threatened. Other important losses contributed to the political pressure for stronger protection. But official city preservation history identifies the destruction of Pennsylvania Station as one of the principal events behind the creation of the system, and the most prominent example of what could happen without it. That timing is what makes the story so difficult to separate from the photographs. The city acquired a stronger preservation mechanism, while one of the buildings most often used to justify that mechanism was already disappearing. The law came soon enough to change what New York could do in future cases. It came too late to reverse Penn Station, and there is one later case that shows how significant that change was. Grand Central Terminal. It was a different building, with a different history and a different owner. Its survival should not be reduced to a simple consequence of Penn Station's demolition, but as a test of the new preservation regime, it is revealing. Grand Central was designated a New York City landmark in 1967. When later development proposals threatened major changes to the terminal, the city now possessed legal authority that had not effectively existed during the Penn Station battle. The dispute eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. In 1978, the court upheld New York's landmark controls. That outcome did not prove that Penn Station certainly would have survived if the law had existed earlier. Historical counterfactuals cannot establish that. What it proved was that the legal environment had changed. By the 1970s, an owner confronting landmark regulation faced something more substantial than protest, criticism, or architectural opinion. The city had a regulatory system capable of saying that the public interest in preserving an important building could constrain what a private owner did with the property. That was precisely the kind of power New York had lacked when Penn Station was being condemned. And this brings us back to the room in the first photograph. At the beginning, the most striking thing about it was scale. The passengers appeared almost insignificant beside the architecture. But after following the station through its engineering drawings, its finances, its redevelopment plans, its protests, its demolition, and the law that followed, the same photograph reveals something else. The room looks permanent, almost absurdly permanent. Granite columns, massive arches, a ceiling 150 feet above the floor, a structure conceived at a scale meant to endure. Yet none of those qualities gave the building legal permanence, and none of them made its architecture indispensable to the railway underneath. That was the vulnerability. Penn Station had been created when transportation infrastructure and monumental civic architecture could be treated as the same investment. By the 1950s and early 1960s, they could be treated as separate economic questions. The railroad beneath the site was still useful. The architectural volume above it could be redeveloped. A financially pressured private owner had reason to pursue that value, and New York had not yet established a preservation system strong enough to make architectural significance a binding consideration. Those forces converged at exactly the wrong moment for the building, not because the station had become meaningless, not because trains had stopped using it, and not because nobody objected. The architecture became economically expendable before the city had acquired effective legal tools for treating its preservation as a public interest. That is why the surviving fragments matter. Weinmann's Night is not simply a sculpture rescued from an old building. The partial column is not simply a piece of stone. The photographs are not simply records of a more decorative railway age. Together, they document the precise problem Penn Station exposed. A structure could be admired. It could be heavily used. It could be widely recognized as architecturally important. And it could still disappear if the economic value of removing it was clear while the legal value of preserving it remained weak. That is the lesson New York did not fully institutionalize until the destruction was already happening, and it changes the meaning of the tiny passengers in that first photograph. They are still the scale of the room, but they are also evidence that the building did not have to become empty before it became disposable. Penn Station did not have to stop working to be destroyed. New York had to lose it before the city developed a system capable of arguing, in law rather than admiration alone, that some architecture could be worth more than the space it occupied.